Gain is just more or less making a sound louder. In circuits, it's more directly correlated with how an amplifier increases or decreases the electric power of a signal, whether it be positive or negative, thus making our ears perceive the sound as louder or quieter. It's not quite volume though, as added gain changes the signal to a point where it could be overdriven. Panning is the act of moving a sound anywhere in the stereo field or playback system. You'll probably hear this best if you wear headphones, but if I were to pan this all the way to the right, it's over here. If I pan this all the way to the left, it's over there. Okay, we're gonna go on to filters now. Filters have different variations which do different functions, but some type of filtering is almost always used in a recording or mix. Low-pass filters allow frequencies below a certain cutoff or value through, while attenuating or reducing all the frequencies above it. Basically, it leaves all the bass of the song. High-pass filters allow frequencies above a certain cutoff or value through, while attenuating or reducing all the frequencies below it. Basically, it leaves all the treble. Resonance acts as a little boost in the signal right before the cutoff frequencies of both filters, and gives a little sense of character. It should be noted that most filters don't just start attenuating at the cutoff, but rather a roll-off slump happens because realistically, nothing is perfect. Bandpass filters contain two cutoff frequencies, leaving only the middle left behind. This effect leaves your audio sounding like it's going through a telephone. This is because telephones need to work on efficient technology, only requiring the most important frequencies to keep the sound intelligible, and don't have time to spend working on frequencies too high or too low. Band reject is the inverse of a bandpass, laying frequencies below the first cutoff and frequencies above the second cutoff through. All pass filters don't do anything. Why do we use them? Because they can be used to change the phase of a signal without changing anything else. What's the phase? Shh, we'll get to that soon. These are really the main types of filters, with everything else building off of their foundation. Comb filters are really just band pass and band reject filters bounced up into one depending on the type. There are two types of comb filters: feed forward and feedback. The term feed forward and feedback comes from how these filters are designed conceptually. In the world of digital signal processing, almost every effect usually implements a simple delay of some sort. Digital audio files are made up of millions and millions of samples, which are timed to play at a certain point for you to hear the sound. It's like frames in a video. If you pause this video and press the full stop button on the desktop, this video will move forward by one frame. A sample is an audio's equivalent of a frame. All this to say, a delay is just something that starts reading the audio theoretically before the first sample. There's nothing there, so it'd just be, well, nothing. Then once it starts reading the audio, because nothing is already in our first spot, the audio is read one sample ahead. Thereby, the reading was delayed by one sample. What does that have to do with filters? Well, comb filters, despite coming with different parameters by wonderful developers, are conceptually built by just two identical audio signals, with one just being slightly delayed. And feed forward and feedback describes how this happens. Feed forward means a delayed sample is fed into the system, while in feedback design, a delayed output is fed back into the signal instead, which is not confusing at all. Wait, so you're saying filters are just delays? Yeah, and that's not the only effect, that's just a delay. But we'll get to the others later. Shelving filters boost or reduce frequencies past or below a cutoff, but don't cut off the frequencies entirely. Parametric equalizers are a bunch of filters put into one, and can be thought of as a panel board that boosts or reduces frequencies at whatever point is being manipulated. In fact, in the real world, that literally is what it is. From here on out though, we're going to talk about modulation effects. Modulation effects usually involve using another signal to alter the effect of the original signal, whether that be your guitar feed or any sound really. Tremolo is an effect that momentarily cuts the feed of your signal.
It's a manual tremolo.
Rotary effects are used to simulate the effect heard when a speaker is rotated while playing a sound, kinda like a police siren or ambulance siren. The Univibe is one of those things that you don't really see around anymore, but was the grandfather of all the effects that we are about to go into, as it was a hodgepodge version of them. It came out in the 60s and was used by legends such as Jimi Hendrix. The idea came about when the creator, Fumio Maeda, wanted to emulate the sound of hearing radio signals undergoing atmospheric modulation. The Univibe is similar to a chorus in sound, but can simulate vibrato and phases as well. Remember how I said that everything is just a delay? Well, we'll see that now. Chorus is an effect that you've heard before if you listen to any indie song ever made in the history of the world and the universe. Or at least after this guy came along. It usually gives off this bright kind of shimmery feel. The effect is achieved by taking an audio signal and mixing it with one or more delayed versions of that signal. The pitch of these delayed versions are typically modulated with an LFO, or low frequency oscillator. Basically think of a signal with a low frequency, so low that we can't hear it, but it's still a signal that exists. I'm not going to go into the whole distinction between a signal and a sound, but if you're interested, there's this pretty cool course on Coursera going into how we hear and why we hear for music purposes. These inaudible signals can then be used to change or edit other signals, which is really the basis of modulation as a whole. In the case of a chorus, it modulates the pitch and sometimes the delay time as well, but within a certain range. A flanger is pretty similar, being a duplication of the signal, but with the delay on the second signal being only a little bit as opposed to the chorus. Wait, didn't you say that the comb filter was kind of like that as well? Well, yeah, because a flanger is one. Although the teeth of the flanger are spaced out by whole integer multiples of the fundamental frequency. Basically, it's spread out with different harmonics. I'm not really going to explain what that means, but just keep that in mind. Flangers are known for spacey, sweepy effects. This is because, like the chorus, modulation takes place, where the second signal's delay is modulated, again in a specific range, but unlike chorus, not its frequency. The output is also usually fed back into the input, which produces a resonance effect to further enhance the feel of the flanger. Phasers are essentially flangers, but are conceptually built differently. While flangers use things like a delay line to delay the second signal, a phaser uses an all-pass filter. Remember when I said that all-pass filters might seem useless, but have the ability to preserve every characteristic apart from phase? Well, here's its use case. There's others as well, but this is a good example. To explain what phase is though, it's really just the point at which a signal starts. There's angles and degrees and radians in the mix too, but just imagine it being the point at which the signal starts. Because this phase is change, the second signal when mixed back into the original signal creates points that are out of phase and are therefore cancelled out, leaving a synthesizer-y electronic feel to the sound, which is why a phaser was actually used for the voice of C-3PO. Again, it's like a flanger, but instead of creating a specific comb-like filter shape, it produces an irregular number of teeth with irregular spacing that is theoretically random based on the input. Finally, in this branch of modulation-based effects, we have vibrato. Vibrato is similar to tremolo, but instead of dipping up and down with gain, it dips up and down with pitch. It's all happening on the same signal though, so it's not like a chorus that separates then mixes. Vibrato itself is a music thing, so you probably know what it is, but it's like when you play a string on a guitar but bend it up and down so it goes a little higher in pitch then comes back down. Think of it as the incorrectly named tremolo bar. It bends all the strings up a little to bend the pitch up a little. Wait, so if it makes a vibrato effect, why is it called a tremolo bar? Because people are stupid, and no one bothered to correct the first guy calling it that, so now we all do. So now that this modulation section is done... I missed one? It's a modulation effect? Then it must be buried deep, and there's no implication that modulation takes place in it at all, or I probably would have heard about it before. Ring modulation is a modulation technique where instead of a signal changing the amplitude or frequency, the modulation signal is another, this time audible signal. To better show what happens, let's take a tremolo effect. We see here that as the modulation signal becomes lower, so does the amplitude of the carrier signal, and so we get the dips in and out of audio. Ring modulation instead produces a signal that's a combination of the sums and differences of the two signals at each given point, giving one signal on the positive side and a horizontally flipped signal at the negative side. Okay, now are we done? No, not really. But these are the main ones you'd see and actually care about modulation being in it. Are we done with delays though? Well, a delay effect literally does what it says on the tin. It delays the sound, the result being an echo-like sound like so. It's achieved by using a delay line and usually a feedback loop that sends the signal back to the output. Thus, if we were to play one note, we don't have to wait for the echoes to finish, as they will just be overlaid by the next note we play. A reverb effect is a fancy delay. Kind of. It's really one of the only effects here that actually models real-life phenomenon. As I'm sure you've heard reverb if you've ever been in a tunnel or a cathedral or anything of that ilk. It's an echo effect, but has a certain damp, spacious quality to it, perceptually at least. In the real world, it really is just produced by the echoes in the surrounding area and the acoustics associated with it. Granted, some frequencies bounce off faster than others, some slower than others, but you get the idea. And this was how reverbs were made originally, with dedicated reverb rooms where a speaker would play a sound and a mic would pick up the sound as well as the other sounds that bounce around in the room. But building an entire room for an effect is kind of mad, and so people got creative. Real creative. And now there's all kinds of reverbs, each of them not only having different parameters, but being built conceptually differently as well, with some using delay lines, some using convolution, some using noise gates, some using springs, and they all sound different as well, like a shimmer reverb that sounds, well, shimmerier. Wait, shimmerier, that's a funny word. It's not red underlined. What? Is that a real word? What the heck? If you want to learn more about reverb, then check out any media with this guy, or Mr. Valhalla himself. He actually has a whole section on the official Valhalla website on building your own reverb and how that can be done, so go check that out. We're reaching the end here, stick with me. Saturation effects include all of these. The basis of saturation is to add harmonics to a signal. How does that work? Well, the output signal when using a saturator would resemble a signal that would be made by adding another signal with a different frequency or harmonic to it. It's also called wave shaping as well, because, well, you're shaping the wave, innit? Saturation is an umbrella term, kind of like how I did with modulation, but underneath saturation, there are three main effects people associate with it. And honestly, all these effects are essentially the same thing. Legitimately, they all do the same thing, but to different degrees. All of them work under the idea of clipping, where the input signal is too much for the system to handle, and so those points get slammed into a horizontal line. In doing so, it produces a signal that looks similar to a signal that would be created if a bunch of other signals of different frequencies were added to it, a la adding harmonics. Where they all differ is how this approach is achieved. Whoa, did this guy just say that distortion pedals equals clipping? Are we serious right now, Cody? Cinemark? More like cringemark, am I right? Am I right? I'm wrong? Okay, this isn't scripted, so I might ramble, hopefully I won't. But here's the thing, clipping is not necessarily exactly what happens in a distortion pedal. See, the thing is that clipping gives a good basis of what the idea is. But let's say if we were to put a sine wave in an actual distortion pedal, which you can see a bunch of different examples of using this video here. I have it linked in the description, so go check that out. But if we were to put a sine wave through a pedal, it would look a bit wonky, not really like the clipping I just showed. Why does it look like this? I'm not really too sure. I believe it has something to do with phase, but at the same time, I haven't researched that much about it. I'm not too sure. But why I'm adding this part in is to just say that if you were to run something through a distortion pedal, it's not exactly the same thing as clipping. The idea is the same, as in there's various degrees of how distorted the signal gets, and in general the concepts are very analogous. If I have any more resources to explain exactly how they work, I'll put that in the description as well, so go check that out. But okay, we're gonna go back to the video now. We have not that much time left. Overdrive introduces soft clipping. This means that there is clipping, but it ain't all that much. The tone obtained is reminiscent of a bluesy kind of sound. In fact, that's where the idea originated from. Although back then, this was just obtained through the amps used, instead of having a dedicated effects circuit like this. You can still hear the guitar pretty clearly actually, but the sound is a bit more smooth and buttery, in particular like melted butter. Distortion introduces hard clipping. This means that there is clipping, but it's considerably more than the overdrive. You can still kind of hear the guitar, but not as much. It's like the butter that isn't really all the way melted, but was put into 2 slices of warm bread, for instance, so it's kind of there. Fuzz fuzz is just off the wall. Going back to the butter analogy, it's cold, it's frigid, it's a stick of butter. It was an effect brought about by a tube mixing console literally having something wrong with it. Not too high gain, no nothing. No, the circuitry had a problem, but it sounded cool. And thus the fuzz was born, producing a sound that honestly, I can't really tell all the time if it's a guitar or not. Is it hard clipping? Is it soft clipping? No, mate, it's a square wave. For reference, there's a section in Cops and Robbers by Underscores, good song, which literally sounds like a synth, but was revealed to be the effect of a fuzz pedal on her guitar. It's crazy. What about just saturation? Well, like I said, it's an umbrella term. So if you find something that's just a saturation effect, well then it's just a combination of these three effects all together. Or at least a saturator should be able to recreate these effects. Okay, and that's every single audio effect under... Oh, come on! Compressors compress your audio. Simple. It's an automatic gain controller. Let's say we have this point in our signal. It compares it to a certain threshold. If it's below the threshold, then nothing happens to it. If it's above, then that point gets lowered in gain based on another parameter, which is a fraction of the distance between the point and the threshold. These parameters are called the threshold and the ratio. The ratio is a fraction. So let's say our point is here and our threshold is here. And let's say our ratio is 2 to 1. If this point is 2 decibels above our threshold, it would be reduced to 1 decibel, or half. If the point was 4 decibels above our threshold, it would be reduced by 2. Again, half. If you want the point to be slammed down to the threshold itself, you would have to theoretically have a ratio of infinity. If you know calculus, this is really just a limit, which is a funny name because, we're gonna go into soon, it's like a limit. It's like a limit, you know what I'm talking about. But before we get into that, compressors also have an attack and release parameter. The attack says how much time to get to the specified ratio point once the point is read above the threshold. The release parameter says how much time to stop reducing the gain of the signal once a point is read that is below the threshold. These wait times are important, as if it were just instant, then there would be this abrupt jump in the signal and will lead to distortion, which is not good, but also can sometimes sound good, I'm not gonna lie. Limiters are really just compressors with these two parameters killed off. It essentially does what I alluded to earlier. It limits the audio under the threshold specified, or gets to the limit, using our calculus analogy. But don't we need those parameters, because didn't you say that aggressive clamping or aggressive shifts in audio would create distortion? Yes! Which is why limiters are kind of finicky. But a good limiter should be able to clamp down the audio and, if anything, only provide soft clipping. Expanders are the opposite of compressors. They make your audio huge by adding negative gain once the point is below the threshold instead. De-essers are compressors made to reduce sibilance. Sibilance is that sound when you say stuff like stuff. Bit crushers are a purely digital concept from the future. Like I said, every single piece of audio we hear from a computer is just a stream of samples. These are made through a process of analog to digital conversion, as analog real-life signals contain infinite values that the computer just cannot comprehend. Thus, the process looks at the signal and just takes a bunch of discrete points so that the derived signal looks well enough to the original. How many samples are taken per second? That's described by the sample rate. The real problem that occurs is if we have a sample rate that's too low, because then who's to say that this signal represents this or this? The computer doesn't really know, and sometimes it flips between the two. This is called aliasing, as it flips between different aliases of a discrete signal. To ensure this doesn't happen, this guy came up with a theory that the sample rate must be more than twice the highest frequency available in the signal, accurately called the Nyquist frequency, or sample rate technically. The sample rate and frequency is used interchangeably. So if there's a constant sine wave of frequency 100 Hz, we must use a sample rate that is above 200 to ensure we get no aliasing. Why'd I go into all of that? Well, because basically we're gonna take all of that and crap on it. Bit crushers allow you to downsample, thereby going under a sample rate specified by the Nyquist, and purposely introduce aliasing because you're a rebel, I guess, I don't know. What about the bit part? Well, not only do analog signals have infinite points between each point is also an infinite value, which again our computers can't handle. Once every sample is taken, each sample is given a number of bits to specify how precise we can get to that infinite value. Think of it as the amount of information the point has to accurately specify what it is. If we have a bit rate of 16 bits, then we have 65,536 possible values we can take to get it right. But if we have a bit rate of 4 bits, then we only get 16 possible values. As you can imagine, This leaves the interpretation to be very limited, and the points are snapped to those 16 values, leaving our sine wave looking like it's pixelated, which is honestly exactly the point. Using bit crushes make your sound akin to a retro game, because back then, they really only had a certain number of bits they can use while implementing audio into games. Bit crushing is really just a distortion, as it ironically takes all the concept of good sounding audio and throws it away. But this produces a sound that has its own characteristics and sounds good in its own right. Vocoders were not made for what they are used for, but here we are. Vocoders take two signals, a carrier and a modulator. It looks at the frequencies of each signal and then maps the amplitude information from the modulator to the carrier so that the amplitude of frequencies for both signals become the same, producing this effect. That could have gone under the modulation section, you know. Huh. But it's cool, cause now we're done. Autotune takes an incoming sound, usually a voice, and tries to make it sound on key by correcting any bad notes. The sound was ideally meant to be subtle, so the listener wouldn't notice, but it's 2024 now, we know better. Talkbox shoots a signal into your mouth, and your mouth becomes an instrument. Or rather, your mouth becomes the envelope for the sound produced by another instrument. Finally, the wah-wah effect. It's basically a filter, usually a bandpass that gets pushed up and down the spectrum. It's not modulated like a flanger because you move it up and down yourself with your feet. All automatic ones move it up and down depending on the amplitude of the incoming signal. Okay, I'm not gonna lie, there really is so much more, but this should give you a basis of what you're gonna get yourself into. So if any of these pique your interest, then please look further into them. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.